Today we have another lecture for the collaborative for the study of Jewish life in the Americas. So it's been a bumper crop this fall. Most of you were at the Pareles lecture, which was wonderful. I think you'll find this the same. Our speaker today is Rachel Gordan, who received her PhD from Harvard in North American religions, and her BA from Yale in American Studies, and her MAR, Masters of Religion. Okay, I've never seen a MAR, from Yale Divinity School. She's held prestigious postdoctoral fellowships at Northwestern University, at the University of Toronto, and then taught at Boston University and Brandeis before she went, and where she is now, the University of Florida, Gainesville. I have read a lot of Rachel Gordan's articles and reviews and have learned a great deal about American Jewry, especially in the period of the 1940s and 50s. And so it's a real pleasure to present her, and she'll be speaking on how Judaism became an American religion, middlebrow culture, and the making of America's third faith, more or less the title of her book based on her dissertation that will be published by Harvard University Press. So, Professor Gordan.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So I want to start with this scene. Here we have a picture of Reform Rabbi Nelson Glick at John F. Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961. And the scene actually comes towards the end of the era that I focus on in my study. So I'm considering the mid-20th century, and I'm thinking of the immediate post-war years, so 1945 up until the very early 1960s, or really JFK's election. This is a time that historians often call Tri-Faith America, or Protestant Catholic Jew America, after the 1955 book that Will Herberg wrote. So on this day, January 20th, 1961, like a line from a joke, 4 clergymen, a minister, a priest, a Greek Orthodox archbishop, and a Reform rabbi participated in John F. Kennedy's inauguration. When Rabbi Nelson Glick appeared before the podium to offer a prayer, he did something unexpected. He recited the benediction in Hebrew. So I want to see if we can just hear a little bit from when he starts to do that. The sound isn't wonderful, but we'll see what we can hear. Okay, and let's actually look at Jackie Kennedy's face here. So he's starting to talk in English, and then he's going to switch over to this other language, Hebrew. So let's hit play.
Repeat the ever new words of the ancient prayer in sacred writ. Adonai v'yisraelka. May the Lord bless thee and keep thee.
Okay. Captured on film, Jackie Kennedy's facial expression registered surprise. Other Americans probably felt something similar, watching a Jew speak a foreign language at this Cold War era ceremony. A history of Jewish involvement in radical activism and the 1952 trial of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had left mid-century Jews wary of displaying difference and raising suspicions of un-American behavior. And in this environment, Cold War Judaism was generally cleaned up and trimmed of much of its Europeanness. Glick, an American-born, tall, clean-shaven Reform rabbi and celebrated archaeologist whose discoveries of ancient civilization landed him on the cover of Time magazine, was an ideal exemplar of Cold War Judaism. By 1961, Rabbi Glick's use of Hebrew, notwithstanding Jackie Kennedy's facial expression, and it was pretty mild, anyway, his use of Hebrew was a relatively safe choice and a sign of a future in which Jews would become increasingly comfortable expressing their religious particularities. So what happened in the mid-20th century that led to this moment? The moment of the inauguration is what I'm talking about. It's worth asking because we're familiar with what a different climate the U.S. offered Jews in the 1930s and 1940s from this early 1960s moment. As Americans debated entering the European War around 1940 and in the beginning of 1941, that's 20 years before this inauguration moment. And at that time, the Jewish cause, that is the idea that Americans might enter this European war in order to save persecuted European Jews, was not a popular cause. And it was not a case that FDR made. In fact, we might say that FDR had to all but make the case that Americans would not be entering the war to save the Jews. So how do we explain this change from the early 40s to 20 years later? That's one way to frame the question of what happened at mid-century to Jews and Judaism. And another way to ask this question I'm asking is suggested by my title, How Judaism Became an American Religion, or How Did Judaism Become One of the Big Three, alongside Protestantism and Catholicism. And since we've got sort of a nice crowd of students, I actually am very interested, based on your own high school and college education, how do you explain this change that we see with Jews in the mid-century, so that post-World War II, we're in a time that historians call Protestant Catholic Jew America. Before that, in the first half of the 20th century, Jews are considered alien, immigrant, other. They're not a mainstream, widely understood religious group. And this whole time, they remain tiny. They're never more than 5% of the American population. And yet, somehow, in terms of the status of Judaism in the imagination or public consciousness of Americans, there's this quick, we might call it a quick upgrade in status. Now they're one of the big three. Why does this happen? Anyone have ideas? What would you tell someone who asked you about this? People heard reasons, history class, anything come up that might, yeah.
Just a guess, but people feeling more sympathetic because of what happened in the Holocaust?
Good point. So the Holocaust, we're expecting this has got to be part of the reason. I agree. I think part of that is Americans defining themselves in contrast to their European enemies. So if they hated and persecuted this tiny group, well then part of what it's going to mean to be a good liberal American is that we embrace them and sort of consider them a major American religion. That's a great reason. Other factors, how else would you explain this shift we see?
Well, in my high school, it would be assimilation. I mean, they just gradually blended in more with American looks, and they weren't off that area.
Right, so this idea of Jews assimilating and becoming normalized, I think a part of what you're talking about might be this rapid shift to the middle class that we find with Jews in the immediate post-war years. Sociologists, social scientists are observing it and realizing that, alone among ethnic groups, Jews are sort of rising very quickly, and that makes them kind of more acceptable or embraceable. It's no longer Jew equals someone poor necessarily in the American imagination, but now we start to think, and we're still definitely in this moment where when we think of Jews in America, we think of middle-class Americans. So to the mainstream Christian American public, Jews start to seem more respectable, more like them. And they move to the suburbs as part of that. They leave their urban ethnic enclaves, which means that they have neighbors who are non-Jews, who actually get to know them instead of just hearing stories about them. So those are a few good reasons. Other reasons, yeah.
What about the service in World War II and and then the GI Bill after that? Must have helped with the class.
Right, so that's a great factor here. Jews' participation in World War II, which again is part of non-Jews getting to know them. It also changes the way Jewish soldiers regard their own religion, because while they're serving, the chaplains are making sure they have religious services and ceremonies. So they're non-Jewish peers will say to them, well, aren't you going to that Seder or that service they've organized? Everyone expects that you will participate in your own religious ceremonies. And in a way that makes some of these Jews who might have been a little in the closet about their Judaism feel like, oh, it's okay. My fellow Americans expect that I do these Jewish things. Now that's considered acceptable because the U.S. Army was treating it that way. Another reason, yeah.
I also think, excuse me, this was something after the war, the post-war era, which is when I grew up. Of course, I was very, very young, so I don't remember everything. There's moral consequences to economic growth. And the kind of liberalization that was going on in American society at that time wasn't just about Jews. There was African Americans, there was the Brown decision in Giant, which was made by George Stevens, who witnessed what happened at the concentration camps, and his films were used in the Nuremberg trials. There's real focus on the Mexican American community. So this economic growth and this boom allowed the formation of a middle class.
Okay, and then I like that first thing you mentioned too, the connection with the liberalization of society. It almost, it sounds like part of what you're saying is the Jews were almost the first in a series of marginalized groups through which the liberal American might have defined himself. So a good liberal American should try to be more accepting of this group that was persecuted. It's our European enemies who treat them harshly. In America post-war, part of the meaning of this war becomes we are a different kind of country, even though, less than a decade earlier, most Americans had not been eager to enter. But once we're in the war, we're trying to figure out, all right, what's going to be the meaning of this, and what's the story we now tell post-war? So these are all really good reasons, for this change that leads us to the how Judaism became one of the big three. I guess the reason I'm focused on in this project is something a little different, and it's what I call the power of the mid-century middlebrow moment in American Jewish culture. So popular culture in the late 1940s and 1950s increasingly presented Judaism as an American religion for the first time. So unlike highbrow literature, which comes later, or highbrow Jewish culture, and these are, say, novels by Philip Roth and Saul Bellow or Bernard Malamud, this is actually the culture that many of my Jewish studies colleagues prefer to talk about and that we're all very proud of. But I'm saying before that highbrow Jewish culture really takes off more in the 60s and towards the end of the 20th century, we have this mid-century middlebrow moment in American Jewish culture that does the work of introducing Jews and Judaism as a middle-class American religion. And it does this to the widest possible audience because it is middlebrow and popular. Not everyone picks up a Philip Roth novel, but some of the examples I'm looking at say these two Jewish singers called the Berry Sisters in the 1950s who appear on the Ed Sullivan Show almost a dozen times in the 50s and sing Hebrew and Yiddish songs. And, they are presented as these Jewish singers. These are, this is popular culture that the average American was more likely to encounter, and through it, encounter a different idea of what Jews and Judaism was. So what is middlebrow? In her study of Asia in the middlebrow American imagination, the American Studies scholar Christina Klein has a definition that I like and that applies to a lot of my examples. So part of what she describes is the broad swath of culture directed toward an audience that rejected, on the one hand, the avant-garde intellectual movements such as existentialism that emanated from Paris, and on the other hand, the pulp culture of comic books and lewd paperbacks. In Klein's work and my own, middlebrow is not just a cultural category, it's also a cultural formation, a more or less self-conscious movement of artists, writers, and intellectuals who shared an aesthetic sensibility and were loosely connected through personal relationships and through an institutional infrastructure of magazines, publishing houses, book clubs, reviewers, and other organizations. So these are a few of the kinds of middlebrow culture that I look at in this book that I'm working on. And so we see we've got a poster from the novel turned Academy Award winning film, Gentleman's Agreement, that comes out in 1947. And then this is the first bestseller by an American rabbi. It's in a group of books that I call Introduction to Judaism books. So these are books that are explaining Judaism to an American public. Here he combines Judaism with psychology, psychiatry, and is explaining the benefits of what his religion can provide. We've got another Intro to Judaism book in that other corner called This Is My God by a popular writer, Herman Wouk, who wrote a book some of you might have had to read in school. The Caine Mutiny was one of his big books that came out in 1952. It won a Pulitzer. But that was also a book about Judaism that he wrote after publishing 4 novels. So it's published in 1959. At that point, Wouk has already been on the cover of Time magazine. He's that level of celebrity. And I got to interview him a few years ago at his home in California, and he said to me, at that point in his career, he felt like he had enough of a following of readers that they would follow him to this topic that they might not have otherwise, which was his Orthodox Judaism. So what makes him interesting as an author who's presenting Judaism to 1950s Americans is that he's not just describing, the reform or conservative Judaism, which are more to the left or often called liberal Judaism. He was describing his own Orthodox Judaism. So this was a form of the tradition that the average American might have thought was weird because it included things like going to a ritual bath or wearing these things called tefillin. In English, the word is phylacteries. So all sorts of practices that would have seemed strange to a Christian. And then in the center there is a cover from Life magazine. This was in 1955. Life did a religion series, and by December of 55, they'd have their big Christianity issue. But in June, they did this Judaism cover story. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But with Gentleman's Agreement on the top, I'm curious, do any of you know kind of the story of that movie? So we've got a main character played by Gregory Peck in the movie, and he is a non-Jew assigned to write a story about anti-Semitism for a liberal magazine, kind of like Time magazine. And in order to do this, he decides in 1940s New York that he will pretend to be a Jew and see what kind of anti-Semitism comes his way. So one of the funny things about this movie when I show students now is he kind of does exactly what we would expect a Jew would not do, which is he repeatedly announces he's Jewish. It's almost as if he's ordering at a restaurant and it's as if, and by the way, I'm Jewish, just to see, what's the reaction. mention. Whereas we could probably imagine that many 1940s Jews were maybe keeping it sort of on the down low if they didn't have to mention it. So in this novel, and the novel is actually very close to the film, there's actually not that many Jewish characters in the story. In a way, it's kind of impressive. The author, Laura Z. Hobson, managed to write the quintessential post-war novel about American anti-Semitism with a real minimum of Jews or Judaism, so that a lot of rabbis' criticism of this novel or their feedback was kind of like, all right, it's great that there's this really popular movie exposing how bad anti-Semitism, but couldn't you at least have a Jewish protagonist or some portrayal of the good things about Judaism too? Whereas the truth was you finished watching this film with no more understanding of Judaism than when you started, because we never see a synagogue, we hear nothing about Jewish ritual or holidays. But that was part of its author's middlebrow strategy. She wanted to reach a wide audience, and another quality of middlebrow culture is this teaching cultural uplift that it offers, so that the average American wants to pick up this book or this article or see this film because it's going to improve me. It's something I want to tell people that I've read or seen. And so, what I say about Gentleman's Agreement, because it won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1948, proving how ripe a time it was for a story about anti-Semitism, is that, Americans didn't just love this film, they loved the fact that they loved it, because it's post-war, and aren't we a wonderful country that, unlike Europe, we put all of this out there, we discuss it, we go to the movie, and then we give it an Academy Award too. So there was sort of this post-war humble brag going on where Americans were saying we might have our problems with anti-Semitism, but as you can see from this film, it's all nonviolent anti-Semitism. It's nothing compared to what was going on in Europe. So her focus on non-Jews in this middlebrow novel and then the film meant that she had to have her non-Jewish main character, Phil Green, played by Gregory Peck. And he was the one who had to do the heroic act of sort of overcoming anti-Semitism in a way. So he learns about it and he comes to feel differently about it. And any thoughts on why this was a particularly good strategy in 1947? I mean, why not do what the rabbis wanted, which was, give us a real, instead of having this guy who writes an article that says, I was Jewish for 6 weeks, you could have someone who was saying, I was Jewish forever, my whole life. But why was this what the author Laura Z. Hobson, why would she want to do this in her popular novel meant for,
People want protagonists they can see themselves in, and they also only trust people that are like themselves.
Right. So really appealing to her audience. It's a great point. She realized, most of America is not Jewish. I want them to be able to see themselves in this and see that they have the possibility of some heroic act in their life too. I mean, this is all starting to seem a little timely now, but what we can imagine is Americans thought, I could speak up the next time I hear anti-Semitism. So what she's doing then is making anti-Semitism into an American problem. It had been thought of as a Jewish problem. You guys have to deal with it in your Jewish organizations. And instead the film was showing, actually we can't do anything about it unless the majority culture wants to do something about it. We're tiny. What difference is that going to make is what its Jewish author was thinking. So it was an effective strategy in a way, because it did end up becoming a very popular novel and film. And I don't think Laura Z. Hobson ever thought this is going to end anti-Semitism. We know that's not what happened, but it did get people talking about it, which is something that middlebrow culture is particularly good about because of the numbers of people it reaches. And this is the portrayal of Judaism that it offered. So in a famous scene in the novel, we've got Gregory Peck with his young son at the breakfast table. He's telling his son about this article he's writing, and his mother is there. And his son asks him, what is a Jew anyway? His son isn't Jewish. He's little, so he doesn't really understand. And Phil says to him, you can be an American and a Catholic, or an American and a Protestant, or an American and a Jew. So this is coming out in 1947. Well before Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew book, but it expresses that same idea that Herberg expressed, which was that now in mid-century post-war America, there are 3 acceptable ways to be an American. It's the Cold War. You need to have a religion. You need to be able to check that box to prove you're not a communist, you're not suspicious. But now we're going to count Judaism as one of them. And I want to compare that to another portrayal of Judaism in popular culture from just 20 years before in The Jazz Singer, where, some of you might have seen this. Judaism is portrayed as old world, foreign, it's in another language, it's poor. And 20 years later, we're up to Judaism is an American religion. It's a real difference we're seeing at mid-century. So the 1940s and 50s were transformative years, I'm arguing, as Judaism shifted from being one of the least understood religions of our time, and that was how one rabbi, Louis Finkelstein, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and the author of his own Intro to Judaism book, it was called The Jews. That's how he described Judaism in the intro to his book. So it goes from there, that least understood, foreign immigrant tradition, to being what is called the third faith in mid-century America. And as sort of evidence of that, the mid-century is also the first time we see rabbis participating in presidential inaugurations. I think we have one rabbi at George Washington's inauguration, but it's not until 1948 that we then have one in the 49 inauguration, the 53, and the next one, and then the 61. We have 4 rabbis present, which is proving this American religion status. And it's also when we see the first religious Jews on the cover of Time magazine. So here is that Louis Finkelstein I just mentioned, who was chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And other scholars and historians have also looked at this time I'm talking about and explained the rise of something called the Judeo-Christian Tradition, which is certainly part of this mid-century movement to mainstream Judaism. But far less attention has been paid, I think, to the kind of Judaism that emerged from the forging of a tri-faith nation. And this happened in part through middlebrow culture. So what kind of Judaism comes out as a result of these popular films and novels and Time and Life magazine articles? Well, it's one that was largely deracinated and devoid of embarrassing religious stigmata. And we see this in some of the film and fiction examples from the time. So what I'm talking about here is portrayals of Judaism that look more like Protestantism and don't have any signs of the Europeanness, the European background of so many Jews, and also don't have too many signs of veering off the path of Protestant paradigms of what religion should be. As the war effort led to a search for a common cause in the early 1940s, middlebrow cultural institutions allowed Americans to take part in a national conversation about the meaning of America that continued into the post-war years. And Jews became part of these national conversations. So in a way, gentleman's agreement is doing that, talking about what kind of America are we going to be post-war, and how being anti-Semitic, and that was actually a term that was used a lot in the 40s, was now becoming a central creed of Americanism in the 1940s. So this is part of that defining themselves in contrast to European enemies. And we can hear in that phrase, anti-Semitism, that it's not completely embracing Jews yet at this point, which isn't surprising to us because we know quotas on Ivy League universities continue into the 60s, and country clubs and hiring policies continue to discriminate against Jews, and even intermarriage isn't rising rapidly at this time. So we know Americans are not yet fully embracing the actual Jew, but that phrase, anti-Semitism, sort of I think, shows you the distance they were taking when it came to trying to come closer to Jews. We are at least against that hateful attitude toward Jews, even if we're not yet fully embracing them. I also want to take a minute to recall how central middlebrow culture is in this country when it comes to changing national conversations around social issues and bringing topics and individuals into public consciousness. So I'm thinking about how television shows such as Will and Grace and Modern Family mainstreamed gay men not that long ago. Or when I was a kid, I remember there was a Tom Hanks movie, Philadelphia, about AIDS. And I just remember feeling like this film was really kind of teaching you the way you were supposed to feel about victims of AIDS at a time when many Americans still thought people who had it were evil, or this was a sign of some kind of moral failing. Or even how in the past 40 years, this country has elected both a movie star and a reality television star to the presidency. So popular culture there bringing individuals into our consciousness. And in the mid-century, surprisingly, a religious group that remained tiny became central to many of these middlebrow portrayals of what America was meant to be. So one of the cultural institutions that I want to spend some time on with you today is the Time Incorporated magazines and its portrayal of Judaism. And here we have another one of these Time magazine covers. This one's from 1955 with a religious Jew on the front. This is that novelist Herman Wouk I mentioned. So he wins the Pulitzer in 52 for the Caine Mutiny. And in 55, when this cover appears, his novel Marjorie Morningstar has just come out. It becomes a film starring Natalie Wood and Gene Kelly a few years later, and they are portraying the Jewish male and female leads. So this is also new. These are mainstream American actors. They don't have this sort of ethnic immigrant look particularly. And also in that movie, Marjorie Morningstar, we see the first middle-class portrayal of Jewish religious ceremonies. We get a bar mitzvah that happens in a pretty middle-class Manhattan synagogue early in the film, and we get a Passover Seder later on. So back to Time, and so he's on the cover of Time, Wouk, and this article about him, which is describing him as the successful, celebrity, rich novelist, also goes into some detail about his Orthodox Jewish observance and how he keeps kosher and prays all the time and does these things that many Americans would have thought were weird. I think there's a line in the Time story about him that says, things that his Jewish friends would think are embarrassing, he does. So he's sort of the poster child for Orthodox Judaism at this point. There's not a lot of examples of successful, celebrity, rich Orthodox Jews being out there about their Judaism as he was. So the publisher of Time, Henry Luce, and here he is with his second wife, Claire Booth Luce. He was the son of Christian missionaries and had a long-standing fascination with religion in a similar way that he was fascinated with politics, business, and culture. And in his correspondence with Time editorial staff during the 1950s, Luce really seemed sincerely interested in religion in almost an academic way. I mean, you get the feeling that he would have liked to take some of our American religious history classes, the way he talks about religion. He's trying to get his editors to do a story on the 18th century founder of Methodism, John Wesley. And you can see them all trying to push this idea off because I don't think they think this is going to be a great, story for Time magazine. But I wanted to just, this actually says April 1925, but it is April 1955. And this is during that year when Life magazine is doing a special religion series. We saw that Judaism story they do in June, and in December they'll do a Christianity, and they also do Buddhism and Islam. And he's writing to his editors, and he's saying why this is a good idea to do this religion series in Life. And he says there is much bigger reason for this idea, namely that religion in America is today such a tremendously interesting topic. It is, of course, interesting to Americans, but religion in America is also beginning to be of considerable interest to people overseas. In fact, Europeans are just beginning to be somewhat amazed by it. They are, for example, just beginning to take seriously the fact that the president of the US is likely to be a fairly serious Christian, and to say so out loud. So Luce just thinks this is inherently interesting, and that all Americans and people outside of the country want to read more about religion in America, which isn't so surprising to us when we remember this is Cold War America, and it is just kind of more in the culture, in the air. Even before that 1955 religion series that he's talking about here, we have a landmark Life cover story called What the Jews Believe. It's by a Reform rabbi from Rochester, New York. It comes out in 1950. And Bernstein, this Reform rabbi, also happens to be the cousin of Milton Steinberg, who's a rabbi at the Park Avenue Synagogue, a conservative synagogue in Manhattan. And Steinberg had also written his own middlebrow, famous Introduction to Judaism book called Basic Judaism that comes out in 1947. This is just to show you some of the many editions of this book, because it does continue to actually be used, maybe not as much today, but within the past generation, converts to Judaism, for instance, might pick it up. It's a pretty brief book. And he's also the author, actually, of what I think might be our first successful novel by an American rabbi. Anyone, if this were a Jewish studies trivia question, anyone have a guess? It was still somewhat popular to read as sort of part of bar mitzvah or confirmation classes when I was younger, but I don't know if it's still popular. Anyone know? As a Driven Leaf, right. So here again, this is a very popular book. He did very well with it. And we can see he's got one that has this foreword by Chaim Potok. Another popular, we could debate whether we would put him in middlebrow, but Potok is coming a bit later. He starts publishing in the later 60s. So he's not totally part of my mid-century moment in American Jewish culture, and he's doing something a little different. And then we also have one with a foreword by a famous LA rabbi, Rabbi David Wolpe. So this is a family that knows something about writing about Jews and Judaism for a mainstream audience. And so part of what I'm talking about here is Jewish book culture in America. So that section of the Barnes and Noble stores that says Judaism and Judaica, well, its seeds were starting to grow in this post-war moment. And that doesn't mean that there weren't previously Jewish books, by which I mean books that were not the Torah or the Talmud or a classical Jewish text. But the idea that Jewish books were not an import from Europe, maybe written in Hebrew or Yiddish, this was a relatively new idea. And of course, we do have the Jewish Publication Society, founded in the late 19th century. But their books were primarily intended for a Jewish audience. And then we also have a woman named Fanny Goldstein, a librarian in Boston, who begins Jewish Book Week in the 1920s that becomes Jewish Book Month. So that's also another seed to this Jewish book culture that takes off more in the post-war years, because she's trying to put the word out there that there's a whole collection of Jewish books for you Americans to read. I mean, she too is mainly thinking about educating Jews who might not know a lot about their tradition. But the post-war Jewish book culture I'm talking about is different, because these are books that are intended primarily for a mixed audience. So it's back to that middlebrow aim of providing cultural uplift and educating Americans who might not otherwise know about Judaism. Now, these authors, like Milton Steinberg and Philip Bernstein, his cousin, and Herman Wouk, who wrote one of these other Introduction to Judaism books, it's not that they weren't concerned with Jewish readers. In fact, honestly, most of them would say that was sort of their primary goal in a way, because they, in some ways, couldn't imagine how many non-Jews are going to buy my book about Judaism. But there was sort of the hope, let me write it in a way that will actually make the story of Judaism interesting even to outsiders. And we're in this era, as we said before, when part of what it means to be a liberal American is that you want to educate yourself about this tiny religious tradition that had been so recently persecuted. Sometimes I kind of compare this to that post 9/11 period, when I remember there were all these books about what is Islam, things you could read in magazines, media presentations, talks. So in a sort of obverse way, after World War II, there's a spotlight shown on this tiny group that a lot of people didn't have such a clear understanding of. And as we mentioned, there weren't a ton of portrayals of it in popular culture before our mid-century moment. So the publishing industry is noting, we've got this Cold War religious revival, interest in books about religion in general. And we've also got new feelings about Jews in the air, such that, publishers and editors at these mainstream publishing houses start to feel like there's something going on here with books about Jews and Judaism. We could actually sell this. So back to our What the Jews Believe article. It's spilled into 10 pages of Life magazine, and it's set out to answer typical questions about Judaism. As the Life editor John Shaw Billings wrote to Rabbi Philip Bernstein in January of 1950, as the two were corresponding about the possibility of Bernstein writing for Life. So this editor Billings wrote, "The article we are looking for is primarily theological. It is not political, it is not cultural, it is not sociological. It answers in the simplest and loftiest terms the Christian questions. What is a good Jew? What does he believe? Why does he believe it? The article for authority should be written by a rabbi, but it is addressed to the non-Jews. Unless the non-Jews understands it and accepts it and warms to its exposition of a faith not his own, the article is a failure." So here, the Life editor made plain, he made it very clear what the goals of most of our post-World War II introduction to Judaism literature was. These were magazine articles and books that attempted to explain, in terms that the majority Christian population would understand, America's third faith. Now, previous decades had seen a few American published primers on Judaism, and Orthodox Rabbi Leo Young's books about Judaism in the 1920s and 1930s were among the most well-regarded of their time. And Reform Rabbi Leo Beck, I think we've got, that's his books. This is Leo Beck's 1905, The Essence of Judaism, was the most well-known internationally of such primers in the early 20th century. But it's only in the post-war era that we find a flowering of these American Intro to Judaism books. Here is just a few of them. So this What the Jews Believe article in Life does get turned into a book. by Bernstein and his cousin Milton Steinberg. Another rabbi wrote one called What is a Jew? So what we can tell from these titles is that it's perfectly acceptable to know next to nothing about a Jew or Judaism. I mean, these are very basic level kind of titles, and in a way that it was actually completely American to want to know more. So no stigma attached to the fact that, there's recognition here that we're mostly talking about an ignorant, low level that we're going to start on. So in the post-war era, we've got authors and rabbis from all of the major movements writing these primers. Milton Steinberg is conservative, Herman Wouk is Orthodox, Bernstein is Reform, and the Rabbi Joshua Loft-Liebman, who wrote that Peace of Mind one that we had earlier, he is also Reform. And over 50 such books and articles were published in the period between 1945 and 1960. And in the year after its publication as a Life article, What the Jews Believe becomes a book. So what was happening in this article, What the Jews Believe, from 1950? First of all, from the title, What the Jews Believe, we can tell something about its focus. Anyone have any ideas? What the Jews Believe, what do we think this article on Judaism is going to do? What the Jews Believe, what are we expecting to read about? You see that title, what do you think you might get a little bit of?
I would think it would contrast with the major culture, which is Christian.
Right, and it's starting from that Christian standpoint. Christians, belief is very central to Protestantism, and that's what that title communicated and what the article was doing, which we hear in the very first lines of the article, which say, the Jew has no single organized church, he has no priests, the concept of salvation by faith is alien to his mind. So we're starting from that belief starting point. I know that some of you have to go to class, so I'm glad that you could be here for the part that you could. It was great to get your thoughts. Just pause for a moment. No problem. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing me.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
You're going to have to fill in.
we're in this Christianity starting point, and I don't know if any of you heard on Fresh Air on Monday, the religion scholar Elaine Pagels from Princeton was talking about her new memoir about religion, and one of the things she was saying is how Protestant-centered we've all been about our investigation of religion. She was saying she thinks belief is, what was her term, belief is overrated, I think is what she said, because she was sort of reflecting on the fact that so many of the religions we study, including Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, to some extent, religion is maybe not as important on a daily basis as practice and community. So in a way, this was a very strange title for an article about Judaism, to start with that belief question. But I have to say, as a historian, I find this very revealing and very honest, even though Bernstein and Life got a lot of criticism. The article was popular, well received, but there was also a lot of criticism that came in, especially from other Jews, because of what we mentioned, and also because they thought this article about Judaism was all very Reform Judaism biased, which was kind of understandable because it was a Reform rabbi presenting his view of Judaism. But as we all are studying history or interested in Judaism from other times, it actually seems very honest to its moment that in the mid-century, as Judaism is first being introduced to Americans as an American religion, sort of has to go through this introduction phase. And I don't find it very surprising that they felt like, in introducing ourselves as representatives of Judaism, let me tell you about myself and my tradition from your, this majority culture Christian perspective. Let me make this understandable to you. In the study of religion, we scholars don't like to do this. We don't want to impose the categories of our own traditions or the traditions that are dominant on others. But for its time and for a clergyman who was very interested in interfaith relations, I think it made a lot of sense and reminds us of, sort of where Jews and Judaism was at this time. As I mentioned, I call this post-war literature that what the Jews believe is part of, I call it Introduction to Judaism literature. And it's not that Americans didn't know about Judaism at all before, but their understanding was murky and very based on the Hebrew Bible. So that we find in the introduction of that Rabbi Louis Finkelstein we saw before, who's the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he has an Intro to Judaism book called The Jews that comes out in the 40s. And in his introduction, he describes his experiences with non-Jewish colleagues in religion and how they still come to him, this was either in the 40s or 30s, with questions about Judaism based on their understanding of it from the Bible. So, asking him, do you still sacrifice? And it's showing him, that's how he comes to that conclusion that Judaism is the least understood religion of his time, which probably wasn't true, but he was just sort of saying it's very surprising how little even his academic colleagues seem to know. What happened at Life is that they tried to learn a bit from that 1950 What the Jews Believe article by the time they came to their religion series in 1955. And so this is that June 13th issue on Judaism. So in this attempt at Judaism, Life decides to get more diverse. It's not just going to be about America this time. And they sort of learned the lesson. We're not just going to do Reform Judaism. But to give you an idea of some of the problems with this second attempt, I want to read a brief excerpt from a very typical response that a Reform rabbi wrote when this issue came out. So he wrote to the editorial staff, someone he knew there. He said, well, it's worse than I thought it would be. Much of the text is fine. I'm eternally grateful to Life for avoiding the common errors and oversimplifications which mark and mar so many essays on Judaism. The writing is excellent too, especially the description of the function of the prophets, the role of the Talmud, the Jewish belief in free will, etc. I would want to underscore my admiration for much of the editorial matter. But Life is primarily a picture magazine, and the illustrations and some of the captions are, as I feared, in the loose tradition of picturing the Jew as quaint. I had the issue in mind yesterday as I visited a television network official. He took a look at the cover, that's this cover, and swore, why is Henry so anxious to make people think that a Jewish woman looks like something in a Turkish harem? He sputtered. Why, indeed? The rabbi explained that most readers would get the impression from Life that most Jews wear beards or yarmulkes because of the way Life had portrayed them. But, quote, the truth of the matter is that in real life, only a very small minority of Jews look like Life's Jews. Beardlessness is true not only of Reform rabbis and laymen, but of conservative laymen and rabbis, and of the vast majority of Orthodox laymen and a majority of Orthodox rabbis. You would never know that if you received your impressions from Life Spread. I hope you do not construe these remarks as indicating a personal dislike for beards. I cherish Jews who wear them, my grandfather did, nor do I feel that a magazine should not publish photos of bearded Jews. Nor do I feel troubled when I see such a photo, for I admire Jews who wear them as a badge, as it were, of their traditionalism. But the Life article purported to depict Jews as they are, and the net result of the piece was to make them out to be bizarre. Do you mean to tell me that in selecting photographs for the piece, Life's men did not know they would create that kind of an impression? Would anyone in Life tell me that the result is not a distortion? So the article this rabbi wrote, quote, might be compared to an essay on Protestantism featuring the Amish. You yourself know how atypical even your Scranton family is. So in this article, it featured a Jewish family. I'm not sure how well, okay, so this isn't a great picture, but there's an actual family they focus on called the Fink family. And they show a traditional wedding with the handkerchiefs and bearded men. They've got the father showing the son how to put on the phylacteries, the tefillin. What else do we have here? We have the bride, this tradition of checking to make sure she's the right one. And I think we've got a sofer here, somebody writing maybe a Torah or a Megillah. So some very traditional scenes, and the focus on this Scranton, Pennsylvania family, the Finks. One of the things I noticed is that I think there were 3 boys in this family, and they all have very traditional names like Moishi and Yossi. Only the girl, to me, this shows the very gendered experience of being Jewish at mid-century. The girl is named Shirley. But the boys have these not very mid-century names. If we think of mid-century as a time of Roberts and Dennis's and Linda's, these Jewish boys are having a different experience. So the rabbi wrote, the family with the grandfather who pulls his shawl over his head, with the children eating with hats, with the veil lifting to make sure the right bride is below, with the boy learning to put on tefillin, with the bearded rabbi and contract signers. So when a bride and groom get married, they're signing this contract that would have been a little foreign to most readers. You know how atypical the family is because you had such a hard time finding it. That's what this rabbi writes. Did not the rarity of this type of family actuate you to report to your editors that there would be something unrepresentative about devoting so much space to them, especially since, in addition to the Scranton family, the picture choosers piled on top of it more beards and yarmulkes, resulting in lopsidedness galore? Your treatment of reform, and conservatism too, is disgraceful. You would get the impression that only Orthodox Jews observe the Jewish holidays. You would get the impression that distinctively Reform practices are horror dancing and Boy Scout trooping. So we hear this rabbi's frustration with the way his tradition is being represented, and we can see the ambivalence that a lot of these mid-century middlebrow portrayals evoked. On the one hand, how wonderful is it that a magazine like Life is doing the special issue on Judaism, but the other side of that was having Jews and Judaism come out of the closet at mid-century and being inserted into public or popular culture meant that now Jews had to care about it in a way, when before it was under wraps. If you didn't want to talk about it, it wasn't out there anyway. And they had to sort of think about what did they want Judaism to be. If some of these non-Jews were presenting this kind of depiction, that prodded a lot of Jews to react to it, to have a feeling about Judaism that they might not have otherwise. And sometimes the response was, I think even so dramatic as to decide that you wanted Judaism to be something that could speak its own language, such that we do get to that Nelson Glick 1961 moment where a Reform rabbi decides it's okay to speak Hebrew at an inauguration, even if someone like Jackie Kennedy would look a little askance at it. So this is a bit of my thoughts on what this mid-century moment in American Jewish culture means for Jews and Judaism, but I'd really love to hear your thoughts too. Thank you. Yes, I think I saw.
What's kind of fascinating is at the same time, Jews did everything possible to not broadcast their success. So you have a proposal to put a religious question on the census, and everyone thinks that's a wonderful idea, people respond. They do a test, the response is overwhelmingly positive, but the Jews campaign against having it in the census for fear that it would show how successful second-generation Jews are, and that would foment possibly anti-Semitism. And they remarkably are successful and get the Secretary of Commerce for the first time ever to veto a census question. And then they get to destroy all the pre-tests that had been done. I mean, it was
a remarkable feat. Yeah, and it does. I mean, I feel like that really fits with this moment of, there's been so much success, but there's still a lot of anxiety about anti-Semitism, which isn't so surprising considering we're only 15 years away from World War II. It's not far below the surface, that fear of what will come back at us if this goes out into the world. Yeah.
The other thing that I kept thinking about is in terms of this kind of acceptance, what isn't portrayed is the association of Judaism with the left. So you got a real, look, we'll take you in. We're going to rebuild Europe. There's plenty of jobs. We'll take you in, but we're not doing this with the left. That's something, we're not, and they badly mistreated Ethel Roseberg, right? So that was not a part of the mainstream that was accepted. And then just thinking about this, like the picture of the jazz singer, and how Jews today are being portrayed just recently.
Yeah.
I mean, George Soros doesn't look like that. But he looks like Gregory Peck. But in fact, I think he looks better than Gregory. That's my bias. But the economic situation in this country now is much different than the economic situation of the post-war era, when we enjoyed this kind of prosperity and abundance because we were rebuilding Europe. And Jews now, some of the things that we've done in this country that has contributed to this kind of, and I'm Jewish, so when I say, and I'm a lawyer, we're kind of in a position where we're facing the backlash of how we have helped to organize this country. So, but it's a different media. It's not Time magazine. I mean, Breitbart isn't even published that way. So.
Right. No, I was thinking that too. Actually, my students brought this to my attention. I guess it was last week that Mike Pence met with a Messianic Jew. And so, some of my students were saying how distorted a picture, exactly, like the rabbi I read, this feeling of, would Americans think that this is Judaism? This is a figure from a group that actually, most of mainstream Judaism doesn't accept. That we in Introduction to teach Introduction to Judaism, I think most of us, or many of us, do not actually include Messianic Jews or only mention them. But I also heard something very similar to this mid-century anxiety about how we are being portrayed. Also, when the Tree of Life, when there were sort of cameras on that scene, friends were telling me, oh, they're only showing Orthodox Jews, or they're only showing the Jews with the beards from the nearby Orthodox synagogue, and they found that upsetting and distorting. So some of this, especially the gentleman's agreement stuff, is sort of becoming a little more timely again. Yes?
I've noticed when other traditions have gone through a moment of some sort of public campaign introducing themselves to Americans who are unlike themselves.
Yeah.
It might be through literature, but other kinds of, there's often gender is a big part of those representations, like assuring Americans that they've got properly ordered gender and modernized gender.
Yes.
Do you see that in in the things that you're looking at?
Absolutely, that's a great point. I mean, the Marjorie Morningstar is one good example. So that's Herman Wouk's 1955 novel that becomes that film with Gene Kelly and Natalie Wood, and it's all about the romance. And it's actually in the UK they love this novel and think of it as an American novel, which it doesn't get quite that. I mean, it's a bestseller here and popular. But critics generally think of Wouk as too middlebrow to really praise him. But she is a Jewish girl growing up in New York City in the 1930s. She goes to Hunter College. She's into theater. She wants to be an actress and see her name on Broadway. It's sort of very typical, American female dreams of that era. Such that I end up feeling that it's really the female characters in a lot of the mid-century novels that are able to come closer to the American ideal. And in fact, one critic, I think it might have been the Time review of Marjorie Morningstar, says that Marjorie has this chiplish shoulder. And I actually think we don't see a Jewish protagonist who doesn't have a chip on her shoulder about being Jewish the way that Marjorie does not, because the men always carry it more. In part, it makes sense. They suffer from anti-Semitism more. They are the ones who are applying to higher education more, trying to go out for certain jobs. Not that women weren't, but the numbers are a little different and we don't hear the same stories. So they really, I think, they are more wearing the banner of the Jew, and I think this gendered experience of Jewishness and anti-Semitism at mid-century allows Jewish women to get closer to the mainstream, and they're often presented that way. That's a great question. Thank you. Bob, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was curious to go back to Peace of Mind.
Yeah.
Which I would be interested in.
Right.
What accounts for the success of that book? Mm-hmm. It sold over 1 million copies. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, it doesn't mention, I don't think, at all the Holocaust at all. Mm-hmm. It's got a section on Freud. Mm-hmm. It has a section. I mean, why are people reading it in addition to Norman Vincent Peale or in addition to Fulton J. Sheen, who writes a kind of oppositional piece?
Yeah, I mean, part of the popularity, I think, gets at a little bit this idea that the liberal American at mid-century is a little interested in this other faith. So on my bookshelf or on my coffee table, or I should be able to tell a friend that I'm not just reading Peale, because everybody's reading Peale, but I am so cultured as to pick up the Jewish version. I guess I also think Jews are kind of owning the modern religion label at mid-century particularly well. In some of what I write about Herman Wouk, I describe how in his Intro to Judaism book, This Is My God from 1959, he has this whole section on Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, the sex researcher. And what he's saying too is in the 50s, now that it's acceptable to talk about sex, this isn't considered smut or something bad. In fact, it's a sign that you're educated and not neurotic. He's pointing out actually Orthodox Judaism has always had something to say about the body and sexuality. And it really is that kind of modern, healthy religion that helps you not have hang-ups about things that we now know you should be more open-minded about. So I think Judaism, you're right. There are other traditions putting out, literature on psychology and mental health too. But Judaism is doing very well with the idea that they are more modern. Of course, the Catholics are labeled not modern for other reasons. We also see, in that vein, the Albert Einstein Medical School is founded at this time by Yeshiva University. So there is the most traditional part of Judaism, founding this med school, putting the name on it of this Jewish celebrity who kind of stands for how we Jews are at the forefront of modern science and understanding. So I feel like it's effective branding at mid-century in some ways. I missed you before. I'm sorry.
One event you haven't talked about is the founding of the state of Israel, and all of a sudden, Jewish state that's an aggressive, warrior-like state that's fighting battles and winning, which changes the perception of Jewish people all over the world and galvanizes a lot of things in America It changes the image of Jews a lot in the world. And does that play into this?
It does. I mean, I think I am somewhat convinced by some of my colleagues who are arguing that in the 67 war it gets even more of a push. But still, the 48, I mean, this is a huge deal, and the fact that it's this sort of democratic baby nation that Americans support and the president supporting, that also adds to the idea of Judaism as maybe more 56. Yeah, I mean, I guess I am sometimes surprised about how little some of my sources are talking about it, and these popular novels. Of course, Exodus is about Israel, but many of the other ones are not talking about Israel as much. But I think you're right, and in the Intro to Judaism articles and books, we see some mention. I think there is sort of a desire to make sure everyone understands we American Jews are Americans, and we're not spending too much time and energy on Israel. And of course, we don't have as much travel at that point either, as will be later. Yes?
I just wanted to say that while this is going on, you still have all these Hollywood studios controlled mostly by Jews, and all these actors, and not only Jewish actors and actresses, changing their last names not to sound ethnic.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Jewish moguls in Hollywood begin, a generation before this. And the story of Gentleman's Agreement is that the Jewish studios did not want to take on this film. So it takes a non-Jew to do it. What's his name? Daryl Zanuck is the producer. So his name makes some people think maybe he's Jewish, but he's not. And Elia Kazan, actually, when I was a kid, I always thought he was Jewish, but of course he's not either. And Laura Z. Hobson, the author, most people thought she wasn't Jewish either because she had been married to this publisher named Hobson. And actually, the other project I'm working on is about her. But when the novel came out, she had all of these fans write to her and say, how wonderful a country is this, that even a non-Jew like you would be so morally outraged by anti-Semitism that you would write this novel about anti-Semitism. And that was the kind of country she wanted to live in, and part of the message of her novel, that it shouldn't matter whether one is Jewish or non-Jewish. That's why she has Phil Green, the non-Jew, kind of fight this evil. So she's doing, I guess I think there's sort of a spectrum of passing, and I think of her as sort of passive passing. She never denied she was Jewish when asked, but she didn't bring it up. And many readers who wrote to her did ask if she was Jewish because the subject. Yes, Steve?
Well, it's hard not to interpret this story as the kind of neutering of Judaism in order to be acceptable, and that the kind of more radical edges had to be polished down, because this is the period of McCarthyism in which Jews were vilified and singled out as proponents among travelers of the Soviet Union. And it's hard not to look at this as a very mixed story, that the acceptance depended so heavily on passing.
Yeah, I mean, you put it so beautifully, and I am certainly not saying these middlebrow portrayals are all positive or all accurate, but I think you're exactly right. We're in that stage of the sort of relationship between Judaism and America post-war, when in order to introduce themselves and to make themselves presentable or acceptable, there is largely a feeling of we have to sort of tweak things a bit. And that is so uncomfortable for us to confront. I think that is some of the reason many of my colleagues don't pay much attention to this culture. Also because it's middlebrow, so it's not as respected, but we feel some pain, whether we're Jewish or not, to notice, it's sort of like that love relationship where someone felt like they couldn't be themselves in order to be accepted. We don't like to see that, and it doesn't mesh with our own values about being authentic. But I think it was what came before the 60s, and even before that early 60 Rabbi Nelson Glick moment. And it reminds us of where Jews were in those post-war years and where Judaism stood in sort of the American consciousness.
Thank you for your talk. I know you're focusing primarily on
middlebrow culture here, shaped by Protestant values, but do you see any areas of interface with other minorities, racial, ethnic minorities, or religious minorities in America at this time? I know immigration is restricted, but Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipinos.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, definitely with African Americans, they come up in a lot of the fiction and some of the film. And I guess just even with the moment, Laura Z. Hobson, for instance, the author of Gentleman's Agreement, starts to write that novel in 1944, which is when Gunnar Myrdal's book, An American Dilemma, comes out. He's a sociologist that the Carnegie Foundation hires, so he's not an American, and they want him to observe sort of what's going on in American society. And the American dilemma, the American problem he observes has to do with race. He thinks race is our big problem in the US, and how can we be fighting this war for tolerance and acceptance when we've got this, that's our dilemma. We've got this huge problem underneath, and it's just this poison, and he thinks it's actually eating away at Americans, because who couldn't be aware that this is our reality, even as we fight claiming that these are our ideals. And so I guess what I think is that was sort of the big issue underlying American society, the racial issue, but it wasn't one that Americans were ready to deal with. And in a way, it almost seems to me like Jews become sort of a stand-in. And the irony is that Nazism is race-based anti-Semitism. But for Americans to make Jews acceptable, they can't really talk about them as race, because that's still a complicated situation. But if we think of them as another religion, well, that's part of our tradition of religious freedom. So the anti-Semitism in America becomes about accepting another religion, a Judeo-Christian tradition that actually falls under the framework of what supposedly is our moral tradition in this country. So in some places in this middlebrow culture, I see some mention to the African American situation and racial tension, but not very direct. It's almost like it's something subconscious. It almost seems like Americans really are not ready to grapple with it. So religion is the language of difference that works and is acceptable. And a little bit about the Japanese. In fact, Laura Z. Hobson is working for Hollywood also in 1944 and is around more Asians and is aware that bigotry she observes, is related to anti-Semitism. I asked her son, she has two grown sons, they're actually, I think, in their 70s or 80s now. I asked one of them a question that I'd heard a lot of other people ask, which was, how could she not have talked about African Americans and racism in this big book about bigotry towards Jews? And he said, and it happens that this son is a professor of African American literature now, but he said he felt that his mother really felt like she wanted to say anti-Semitism was actually a problem that deserved attention on its own, as in it doesn't need to be attached to many of these other big problems we have, which is something that people thought other artists and writers were doing. And when there was talk of the novel being made into a film, I remember one of the letters I came across said something like, I hope when they do it, they don't make it a movie about blacks instead of about Jews, because that's what's easy for the studios to do now. So that was sort of interesting to me. I think I'm still trying to understand that. But anyway, I think there was often some level of comparison going on, especially between the African American and Jewish situation. Thank you. I didn't get you before, so.
I've often wondered why there's such a difference in the way fundamentalist Christians look at Jews in the 50s and 60s and the way they do now. Back then, there was a lot of antipathy toward the Jews, because why shouldn't there be? Because they killed Christ. Now people realize Christ was a Jew. They want to try to recover his Jewishness. They want to learn about the Jewish religion, because that's the religion Jesus practiced. Do you think this is an entirely separate phenomenon from what you're talking about, or has to do, or came about in part as a result of the acceptance of Jews as a legitimate religion in America?
Yeah, the evangelical interest in Jews, I think, probably some of it was helped by this normalizing and familiarizing work that's going on in the mid-century. But you're right, it does in some ways seem like a parallel strand because it's so based in the religion and theology of evangelicals that they're actually, what most of Americans were encountering Jews through popular culture. You and I are talking about a group that actually would have encountered Jews through Bible study and, discussion with other church members. So I do think they're somewhat separate, but it probably helped to have Jews become more familiar.
I just want to follow up on something that Bob said, because when you put peace of mind up there, that was a book my father told me to read over and over
Wow.
again. And he told me to read it when I was, in the 60s during the anti-war thing. So I've been thinking about your, flickering on my childhood. They had a bookcase. Marjorie Morningstar was in the book. Herman Wouk was in there. Peace of Mind was in there. Stefan Zweig's biography of Marie Antoinette was in there. But on the side of the bookcase was a portrait of my father's brother, who was involved in the invasion of Sicily, got malaria. They told him to go home, and he wouldn't go home, and he was killed somewhere in Italy serving donuts to the troops. My dad had to absorb that experience of the war. And I think that for a lot of Jews, they had to come back and really sort through it. He lost a brother, and a lot of Jews in America lost a lot more than he did. And somehow or another, this idea of acceptance, and also there must have been, I never read it, I never read Peace of Mind. But he got some sense of, he got some kind of peace of mind out of looking at that book and studying it. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that also because it resonates with a lot of the letters I find from readers who read various Intro to Judaism books. What I didn't realize and what they were all writing was they would say, this is the first time I read such a dignified kind of American presentation of my religion, which Joshua Locke-Liebman was offering in Peace of Mind too. So the idea that, we were just killed for this over there, but here this is presented as something, that we can sort of ascribe to with dignity, and that people respect this book and this author who has something to say about this tradition. I can feel how that would provide some comfort.
Yes. When did the phrase "some of my best friends" emerge?
Right.
Because it seems in my lifetime that it's emerged from an expression of tolerance in a way too, kind of head slapping.
You're right. Yeah, and it is in the movie Gentleman's Agreement, so in the 40s. That's a good question when we start to hear that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a
Pleasure.
wonderful lecture and for
Thank
fielding
you.
so many questions.
My pleasure.